Hi everybody, Andreas here. In today's podcast, we will look at fiscal policy and how do governments implement and deploy fiscal policy tools in order to adjust the trajectory of their either expanding or contracting economies. Without further ado, let's get started. Fiscal policy essentially refers to the actions taken by a country's government to affect the economy, usually to lower unemployment rates and boost economic growth. Practically, fiscal policy entails the means by which a government adjusts its spending levels and tax policies to influence a nation's economy and more specifically its economic conditions. When economists seek to analyze the economic conditions of a country, they usually refer to the aggregate demand of goods and services, employment, inflation, and general level of growth of the specific nation. There are two main types of fiscal policy: expansionary fiscal policy, and on the flip side, the so-called contractionary or restrictive fiscal policy. Now, in order to understand how government deploys its fiscal policy tools, we're going to visit two scenarios. One, where an economy is experiencing a slow growth period or a recession, and the other, where inflationary pressures and other over-expansionary symptoms stretch a country's economic system. Let us begin with the former. In a scenario where an economy is facing deteriorating economic conditions and is or is about to enter a slow growth phase, the country's government might feel the urge to increase liquidity in the market by lowering taxes and at the same time increase public spending, which in turn increases the aggregate demand for goods and services within its economy and fuel economic growth. The rationale behind this approach is as follows. As the economy enjoys a higher degree of liquidity, the economy's participants are more likely to either invest or spend the extra money, thus fuel increased levels of consumer demand. That same demand essentially incentivizes companies to expand their operations to increase the supply side, thus provide more goods and services, which leads to the creation of new jobs, which usually leads to the reduction of the unemployment within the country. As a result, this could lead to higher wages amongst the workforce and therefore provide consumer more income to spend and invest, creating a so-called positive feedback loop. From the government's point of view, in times where an expansionary fiscal policy is implemented, a government may increase its domestic spending by allocating capital for expansion of infrastructure projects such as schools, hospitals, roads and highways, among others, creating more jobs in the public sector and thus increase demand and growth domestically. On the matter of taxation, governments restricting liquidity outflows from the economy would indirectly allow for consumers and businesses to maintain a higher allocation for expenditure and investment. In other words, tax cuts are another form of expansionary fiscal policy alongside government expenditure that can help an economy recover from a recession. Now, turning our attention towards the other type of fiscal policy, the contractionary or restrictive fiscal policy, we will consider the scenario where an economy is running ahead of itself, inflationary pressures are mounting, and other over-expansionary symptoms stretch a country's economic system. The preferred course of action for governments under such circumstances is to proceed with reducing spending and or raising taxation levels in an attempt to drain excess liquidity within the economy in hopes of bringing asset prices down. Usually, government resorts to unwinding previous expansionary fiscal policy plans and tend to avoid raises in taxation, as that may bring public unrest with rising discontent towards the political party in power. It should be noted, however, that the above course of action is a delicate balancing act which can have immense drawbacks such as an induced recession should the government cut public spending too much, either by restricting subsidies, transfer payments to welfare programs, or contracts to public infrastructure works. Should government spending cuts go too far, there is a risk of mass layoffs in the public sector, thus give rise to the unsustainable rises of unemployment rate within the economy, hampering consumer confidence and stagnate consumer spending, and thus contribute to the slowdown of economic growth of the country. This brings us to the end of today's podcast, where we went over the types of fiscal policies and how governments implement fiscal policy tools in periods of slow growth or overtly expansive economic conditions. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned.